Good evening to all. Welcome to our webinar on the Hybrid Church Goes Global. Before I start, just want to test that, Pete, you hear me loud and clear? Is it okay? Good. Well, I'm Dr. Lai Pak Hua, the principal of the Biblical Graduate School of Theology, or BGST. The school is also a founder of the Theology for Life, or TFL platform. Now, it's good to have all of you here today to join us for the discussions and talks by our panel of global speakers. Now, today we have the pleasure of three digital theologians, so to speak, with us. Now, the first is Dr. Pete Phillips from Premier and Spurgeon's College, UK. So there's the handsome guy there raising his hands. And of course, we have Dr. Katherine Smith, who is chiming in from Wally College, New York. What time is it, Katherine? It's probably 8 a.m., I suppose.
8 a.m., yep.
8 a.m., yep. Okay, and the third is Dr. Ray Crisaldo from World Evangelical Alliance, and he is based in the Philippines. Now, together, they shall be sharing with us what does the hybrid church entails for their part of the world. Now, let me start by walking through the schedule for this evening. Now, first of all, this webinar is the launch of Premier Digital's Hybrid Church course at the Theology for Life platform. Now, what is the, and so later on, I will introduce you to the platform itself. Thereafter, shortly after, we will hand the time to Pete, who will introduce to us the concept of the hybrid church. And then in conversation with Katherine and Ray to talk about different perspectives on hybridity, the global response to hybridity, and so on. And then we finish at about 8:55 or 1:55 p.m. UK time. We will look at the global responses when the panelists will come together and have a chit chat, followed by Q&A. And for about 10-15 minutes, we hope to finish about 2:15 and 9:15 p.m. This is the first time I'm using two different time zones at our schedule. Sorry, Katherine, we forgot about the US time zone. And so this is basically where we are in terms of our roadmap. Now, let me just give you an introduction to the Theology for Life platform. The platform was just launched on September 3rd, and it's basically an online digital learning platform that seeks to provide training for Christians to help them to grow in faith and to equip themselves for ministry at work, church, and society. Now, the focus here is to rally together Asian Christians, parachurches, seminaries, and also global partners to focus on the concerns and perspectives of Asian Christians, and of which the hybrid church is one important concern. It cuts across every single culture. It's a global phenomenon. And so we are glad to collaborate with Premier to launch our first microlearning course for the hybrid church. And this is taught by none other than Pete Phillips. And so for those interested to find out more about the course, you can visit the platform using the QR code here, to scan your phone with that, or to visit us at the theologyforlife.sg platform. Now, for those of you who are interested to collaborate with the TFL, you can also go to the website and then just click contact us or email us at contactus@theologyforlife.sg. Now, finally, before I hand the time over to Pete, I'd like to remind all that you can put up your questions along the way as our speakers share their knowledge using the webinar Q&A button. So just click the Q&A button, put in your questions, and we will have them answer them during the panelist sessions and the Q&A session. So without further ado now, I'll pass the time over to Pete.
Hello, everybody, and it's really good to be with you. Good morning to you, whether you're in Singapore, in the UK, in the States. Katherine, thank you so much for getting up so early to contribute to this. It's really good to see you. We're going to look at hybrid church and look at how this new form of church is developing across the world at the moment. And I'm going to, could you move on the next slide, please? Thank you very much. So this is something that a little diagram that Stephen Garner started doing. He's a colleague of ours in digital theology down from New Zealand in a completely different time zone as well. And he kind of mapped what we've just gone through across the world in this kind of pandemic grid or pandemic honeycomb. And you can see we start from the left-hand side with the masks starting, and the kind of shift that that caused in the global church, as church buildings were often closed down, and instead we were forced to do things in different ways. Lots of us jumped online with our churches. Some people faster than others. Some people just met outside, or, you know, when things got even worse, then we kind of did lots of things. Sadly, a lot of people decided not to go to church from that point onwards. And we're finding now lots of people over that period lost their habit of coming to church. So here in the UK, we're seeing about a third at the moment of people coming back to on-site church, despite the fact that we're still continuing a lot of the time with online church as well. But from the mass kind of thing, this is that we got rhythms of life going. We had a pragmatic response, huge burst of creativity with people doing live streaming or Zoom church or Teams church or whatever it might be. Phone churches were really popular in the mountainous regions in our own country. But lots of other possibilities. People using papers to visit people and pass through their letterboxes so they could share Sundays together. Of course, as the pandemic wore on, we had more and more trauma and exhaustion. And to some extent, that kind of bent over person there perhaps represents a lot of people in ministry at the moment, where they're really exhausted and tired by what happened during the lockdown. And end up kind of with this kind of sense of where do we go now, and how can we continue to do something? And so then we kind of push into this concept of hybrid church, because we want to kind of maintain this idea of a church which is both online and on site, a church where people can engage with different kinds of church in a place where they feel safe and they feel secure and they can come and worship the Lord. Hybrid church is a place where we can continue to gather together. So therefore we feel that kind of request, or that kind of command in Hebrews, to continue meeting together online or on site. In the next slide, I'm going to kind of look at a hybrid church spectrum that was developed by Adam Sanders here in the UK. And he kind of starts here on the left with a church with no online presence, and shifts all the way over to a completely online digital church. Well, on the far right-hand side at the bottom. And lots of things in between there you can kind of see as people gradually shift from the left to more and more digitality. To some extent, we want to be in the middle at the top, church where online and offline participants can all become members and fully participate. And that's what this course is about. How do we do that? How do we do that in different contexts with different access to technology? How can we do that with different asynchronous and synchronous engagement and so on? But it's a place even in our business meetings where we need to share both online and on-site. It's not offline really, it's on-site that we need to do. I think Adam uses the phrase online and on-site. Oh dear, my slides just went. It's a good job I've got them here. I tend to prefer to use online and on-site rather than the other. On the next slide, it was going to say, which I hope
sorry, it hung. It's going to be back in a minute. Sorry.
Okay, that's okay. That's okay. There were some revolutionary shifts caused by this pandemic. We've already talked about the kind of technological shift, but there was also a general worship shift, kind of through our digital experimentation. We became brilliant. Oh, great.
Wait.
Next slide over.
Next slide. Okay.
Yeah. So we had this kind of digital experimentation in what we were doing, this kind of seeker-friendly worship. People in the United Kingdom talked about us giving them a sofa behind the back pew where they could sit, or a lounge behind the back pew where they could sit and watch what we were doing in the comfort of their homes, where and look in and see what church was really like. Because I don't know about your situation, but here in the UK, we often have church buildings that are made out of stone or brick or what have you, and they're closed at the front. You know, there are doors and so on. Keep the cold wind and the rain out. Sometimes it does that here. And so we kind of, people can't see what we get up to inside the church. But with this worship shift of going online and live streaming and so on, we begin to see people are able to come along and see what happens in church. And that's a great move because it allows people to lose their fear of what's going on in church. And they can kind of say, oh, well, we recognize it now and so on. But there's also kind of, that means there's a globalized flavor to our worship as well. It's because we can kind of link up with lots of people around the world and include those who have often been marginalized. There's also a missional shift. What's God up to in all of this? It's an open, accessible church, giving us open access to God. So instead of those of us who are ministers or what have you, kind of protecting God, brokering access to God, we instead said, let God be the one who kind of makes himself known to people through this medium, through the online medium and so on. There's also a justice shift, a church serving the needs of the poor. And often we found online churches, hybrid churches and on-site churches as well, kind of push towards a sense of how can we help people? How can we serve people in this time of pandemic? How can we help people get through it? And that still needs to go on. And of course, in the UK, we found that the governments and people have begun reassessing the importance of church in our network society. There are also theological shifts. The church has a mission, in itself, kind of fulfilling the Missio Dei, but also the church is a network community, just like society, a community which needs to pick up upon the news world in which we live, where people are often on their devices, often engaged in the network, as it were, rather than necessarily with the people who are on site. And that's a kind of big shift that's going on at the moment with the whole world. So in the next slide, we kind of pick up some of those big changes. So pandemics don't kind of bring in new things. Pandemics seek to sometimes kind of, they seem to accelerate existing societal shifts. So things that were happening before the pandemic are really sped up during the pandemic. You can see that in our global healthcare problems. You can see that here in the UK, especially with healthcare and so on. You can see it with the politics and so on and what have you. But there's a big research report come out at the moment called the Global Smartphone Research from the University College of London. And that's an anthropological based report. And the Global Smartphone Research says, actually, we've created a new world, a network society, where everything is fluid, where suddenly our friends aren't necessarily near our homes, nor at our work, because we've not been there. Our friends and our church are all based on these smartphone devices. So the smartphone, in a way, becomes the location of our home, of our social network. Is this the place which we interact with people all the time? So they talk about the death of distance, the fact that we can communicate here across most of the world. You know, we've got Katherine in America and Pakwa and BGS team, what have you, in Singapore, myself in between in the UK, Ray over in the Philippines and so on. But we had a recent research seminar where we also included people from Oceania and Australia, and also getting into kind of further into America as well. So the death of distance, the fact that you can now, who is my neighbor in this new world that we've created, but also the death of proximity, in that as soon as you take out one of these with somebody else, oh, suddenly you're wrapped up in the phone and you stopped actually engaging with the people who you're talking to. Notice that happened there online. There's a kind of disconnect all the time as I read the screen rather than looked at what I'm doing. A breakdown of social etiquette for proximal engagement. And also, as Heidi Campbell has argued, Heidi's a professor at Texas A&M University, one of the leading scholars in digital religion in the whole world. And she talks about two things. First of all, the shifting of authority, where digital creatives have much more power and authority in our churches. And that's a good thing. They need to be engaged with by our leadership teams and so on. But also the talk of the social shaping of technology, that we're not bound to do what Facebook tells us to do, not bound to do hybrid church in the way that we're told to do by the tech companies. Instead, we can shape that technology ourselves. Doris asked a question before about whether we're going to talk about the biblical model of church, of hybrid church. Well, we all know what the biblical model of church is: to meet around the apostles' teaching, to break bread together, to meet together, to worship God and to pray to him, to allow his spirit to speak to us. That's the biblical model for any form of church. And that's what we need for hybrid church as well. And what we want to do with this course and with our current teaching around this area is to say, how do we apply the biblical principles to this new technological form? Not just let the tech run it for us, but actually shape that technology for ourselves. Over at Premier, I'm going to one more slide for me and then I've finished. Over at Premier in the UK, we've created a hybrid church charter, and you can see it here, and there's a link to it there if you want to go for it. But this hybrid church charter is to provide a way to digitally access church services, both in real time and on demand, but also on site and online. It's not a call for digital only church, honest. It's a call to say that church will be in many places, both in this place online, in online spaces, but also on site in buildings or in houses or in public spaces. Wherever God's people meet together, where they gather together, that's where 2 or 3 people meet. That's where we want hybrid church to be part of what God is doing in the world. And if you want to join us in the hybrid church charter, do the course, sign up to the charter, and let's see where we go. And thank you very much for listening to me. I think that's my last slide now, and I'll pass back to, well, we're going to have a chat with Katherine, I think, which is very, very good. So let me just put my pictures on again. So Katherine, hi, you're right.
Hello, good. How are you?
Yeah, I'm very good, thank you. It's really good to see you again.
Nice to
how
see you.
are things in New York with this pandemic and everything?
Oh, it's been interesting. I've noticed that we have a large influx of tourists, which we haven't seen in a while. And so that makes me a little bit nervous because I'm not sure how many of them are vaccinated, given the political climate in the United States. But the city actually does require a vaccine for going into restaurants and things like that. So we'll hope that the numbers stay down. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. And is the church open or most churches open now?
Yes. And, it depends sort of on individual churches, but still practicing social distancing as much as possible. And again, depends on the state and the city, whether or not masks are still mandated. So it varies wildly, but
Brilliant.
yeah.
Anyway, let's not kind of take your time. You're going to talk upon this fantastic concept of inevitable hybridity, which go for it, and I'll just shut up.
Sure. So for a while I was kind of enamored with the category of the virtual. I was trying to figure out what can we say theologically about the reality of the virtual. And I think it really was the pandemic that I kept hearing the word hybrid and the word high flex, and I had heard it before as an educator, but not to the extent that I had heard it during the pandemic. So I started thinking about this category of hybridity, and the title sort of gives away my punchline here, which is just that I think there's an inevitability to being hybrid church, and I want to argue that there are already ways in which we are already deeply hybrid as a church. So if you go to the first slide for me, please. So I began sort of exploring this category of hybridity. I'm still researching this, and I would say I can approach it sort of from the theological or from what I'm calling the cultural historical. And the theological, I think this might be on the next slide. The theological, this really does address the question, I think, of the biblicals, because beyond what Pete said, which absolutely is right about the apostolic church, there's also in the Hebrew Bible this notion of the chosen people, which on some level does seem to be a bit of a hybrid category, right? So you have people that are clearly in the world and, carry with them all of the trappings of history and all of the trappings of their own failings. But you have this idea that they've been set apart. And so as this kind of, in between space of being people, but being the chosen people, there is something there, I think, that is a bit of a hybrid. So I think you already see this in the Hebrew Bible. And then also this notion of the diaspora, a diaspora being, in and of itself, a kind of in-between space. So maybe there is a way for us to think about some of these themes as being hybrid. And then, kind of moving to the New Testament, but also in the Hebrew Bible, this idea of what I call here the eschatological suspension, meaning that carrying forward this idea of being the chosen people, kind of being, in the world, but not of the world in some regard, there does seem to be a kind of hybrid nature to us as God's people, in that we are clearly in history, but we are always, waiting in hope eschatologically. And then lastly, and this is sort of, I think, a provocation, and I'd be interested to hear what people think about this, is there a way that we can think about Christ and the way that we think about the incarnation? Do we think about that as hybrid? And so I'm going to give you some thoughts on kind of, models for hybridity, and maybe that'll help a little bit. But there is a way in which, being fully human and fully divine, that what we have in Jesus is something like a hybrid. We have something new, but at the same time reflective of two other realities. Next slide, please. So I began thinking about different areas in which the hybrid pops up, and the three that really come to the fore are the biological, the cultural, and the linguistic. And the linguistic, or the language one, falling within the cultural as well. The biological is really where it comes from. So this notion of the hybrid, the first time that I remember hearing about a hybrid was in science class, where we were talking about, hybrid species, or, hybrids of plants and things like that. And that really is where it comes from. And then kind of leading into the cultural, this kind of gets to some of the critical questions that we might have about hybridity, because it was used during, it was used as a category in thinking about race predominantly in colonialism, but also in systems of white supremacy, especially in the United States, and thinking about race mixing, right? So the biological kind of gets appropriated for this sort of cultural understanding of race. And what's wrong with that? Well, what's wrong with that is that, for many reasons, but the big thing that's wrong with that is that the biological understanding, we often think of taking two things and putting them together and having some sort of tainted third thing, right? Something that is not pure or is somehow, less than. So the example biologically that comes to mind is the creation of something like a mule, right? Which is not, seen as good as its antecedents. So this is a problem, right? If we kind of take this in, it's a problem for many reasons, but the big reason is this understanding of the hybrid as being somehow less than, as being somehow, impure. And that kind of gives us the false impression that we will somehow get back to purity, right? Which is never the case. And we see this with the linguistic category. It's from this that we see, languages themselves are constantly hybrids, in that they are always evolving, and they're always bringing things together and creating new languages, new vocabularies, new syntaxes, those kinds of things. Next slide, please. Yeah, so here's the biological, right? So it comes from the word hybrida, which is the mating of a tame sow with a wild boar. And so again, you see that sort of, the wildness of the boar somehow tainting the tameness of the sow. And so there's all of this baggage about purity, and kind of, again, a third thing that is somehow less than. Next slide, please. And then go on one more, please. Thank you. So what can we take away from some of this stuff? So as I've mentioned, the biggest danger, I think, is importing what I'm calling the anxieties of scientific racism. So this idea that, I think we carry with us the anxieties, even if we are not operating consciously in this sort of like racial understanding. I think that purity myth, the myth of the purity and the tainted third product of the hybrid, we do bring into some of our discussions. So this illusion of a pure antecedent. This is, I think, a persistent issue for theologians. I think it's a persistent issue for anybody in the church, that we not somehow want to return to what we perceive to be a golden age. I think that all people on, whatever your perspectives theologically or politically, ideologically, it is always a temptation to think, oh, that's the point in history where the church had it right. And we just know that historically, I mean, it's just not, it's disingenuous to think that way. And it's also, I think, a kind of shirking of our present responsibilities, right? We can only be in the history and in the culture in which we now live. And so what can we do now? What about some of the positives? So one of the positives is that from the cultural or the linguistic side of hybridity, there is this dynamism, right? So this understanding of like constant evolution, constant change. And what I appreciate about this from a theological perspective is this reminder of the church as a pilgrim church, that we are always on a journey, and that it is, it is not stagnant, and that, there is, I think, comfort in that, but then there's also a kind of challenge, that we are on the road, as it were. And then, as much as it's about dynamism, it's also about the persistence of hybridity, that if it's true that languages are always evolving, and this is a good model for the way that we might think about, the ways in which the church is evolving, there is a stability in that. There is stability in change, ironically. Next slide, please. And then this is a little more playful, I think. I was thinking about other areas in which the hybrid might be used. And one thing that came to mind is the automotive, right? So after I remember science class, then I remembered hybrid vehicles, learning about hybrid vehicles. And what's interesting about this is that although it does retain some of the problems of, having two things and bringing them together for a third, there is somewhat of an understanding within the sort of cultural understanding of the hybrid vehicle, that by combining these two things, we're actually creating a third thing that actually might be better than the other two, right? So there are advantages to having a hybrid vehicle that are not as, that the other two things that came together, somehow lack. So that's interesting, right? Because it goes in another direction from the biological or the racial. And then the educational. And I find this one to be, I think, perhaps most helpful for the church, because, like I said, I started thinking about hybridity predominantly because I'm an educator, and, we started thinking about different models of education. And so I think there's a really close analogy here for the way that educators have anxiety about hybrid education or online education. And, the issue is that when we have all of this anxiety about hybrid education, what we fail to see are the ways in which we've always been hybrid, the ways in which the classroom, as much as we think it's this, idealized version of some sort of non-technological space, that's just not the case. And to Pete's point, I was unfamiliar with the research that you mentioned, Pete, but the point about the smartphone is very interesting, because even though, that's, cutting edge research, to the extent that we've ever had technology in the classroom, technology of any kind, that space has already been hybridized, right? And, that's been going on for at least since I think I've been alive. So, so hybridity is I would say not new, and it is inevitable. And how we negotiate that, of course, is still up for debate. But I would really just challenge us to think about all the ways in which our spaces are not pure, right? We can't return to a golden age. We can't return to this understanding that on-site is somehow always going to be privileged over the online. And I think one way to do that is to recognize the sort of inevitability of hybridity going forward, but also that, you know, we have been hybrid for a very long time. I think that's my time. I'm not sure. I can't remember the schedule, but but I really appreciate you all inviting me. This is lovely. It's so good to be with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Katherine. We're going to come back in a little bit for all of us to have a chat together about these concepts. But I really like the idea, the kind of the educational hybridity. That's really on. I feel car hybrids kind of is a bit of a cheat, and it's not a very good advert for it, is it? But it's interesting. But Ray, thank you so much for joining us. So you've just moved posts. You're now heading up the World Evangelical something or other. Is that right?
Alliance, that the Theological Commission of the WEA, right?
Right, of WEA, right. So it's really good that you give us time to do. That's great. And you're based in the Philippines, is that right?
Yes, I'm based out of Manila, and as you know, same time zone as Singapore.
Right, that's really good then. Excellent. So you've got lots and lots of slides, so I better not chat with you. Go for it. Go for it.
Okay, maybe I would just like to add to Catrion. Whenever I think of hybrid, I think of Blade and in Kate Beckinsale's Underworld, wherein towards the end of the series, if you're a hybrid, if you're half vampire, half lycan, you're more stronger, right? So anyway, but I like what Katherine said, that we've always been hybrid, and it is not new. And I would like to say that that the church has always been hybrid. So if you could just follow me in my slides as I speak, it will help you if my English is more Filipino than real English. So I say this because spread across the Roman Empire, the early church is held closely together as a network of scattered communities through the writings of Apostle Paul. And I would say these writings allowed him to have a sort of a virtual ministry, an ancient form, as if we can put it like that. And what we have here actually are a number of local churches who might probably never see each other in person ever, but they are closely linked nonetheless to one another by the circulation of Apostle Paul's letter from one church to the other. And we would see this, for example, very clearly between the believers at Colossae and Laodicea, who were instructed to swap letters and benefit from what the good apostle had to say to each of them. You could read that in Colossians chapter 4, verse 16. And Bible scholars note that in the ancient world, this was a pioneering and a very innovative use of epistles as a medium of instruction for religious communities. And I think this is what made the early church as a network of believers with flesh and blood, yes, but also at the same time mediated by the technology available to them, which would be ink and parchments, right? And I think it's not so much different from how the church today is held closely together in bytes and pixels mediated by Zoom and Wi-Fi, as we are having now. Not so much a physical fellowship in the sense of being in the same room and breathing the same air, but definitely no less real a fellowship, meeting in digital spaces via shared screen. And I'm just so happy that I could be with Pete and Katherine now and Pacquiao. And I think it takes something to be able to recognize this shift. I think it would have us looking at communications technology, whether it's an ancient form like epistles or a social networking app like we have today, from merely a tool that we use to an environment that we inhabit. Social media, for example, a lot of people say is a language. And I would like to add, social media is a landscape. It is now where people are interacting. It is now what people are communicating with. So I think there's no question anymore of whether the church is to go digital or not, or whether it should continue to go digital. The more interesting question for me is how this digital space that the pandemic has forced churches all over the world to now inhabit amidst the lockdown shall continue to shape the usual spaces and ways of gathering as a community, which now lead me to my second point, that the pandemic experience of digitality leads to more hybridity. I mean, even before pandemic, Pete has mentioned, churches have explored using digital technology to supplement its ministry. But for those churches who have experienced meeting, gathering, and doing ministry almost entirely online, there are already realizations that this new frontier comes with opportunities that are unique to itself. What I mean by that is that new experiences that are deeply formative, but can hardly be, and perhaps should not be, recreated when the church buildings start to open and people start to gather again in the same room. And just so because these possibilities that open up are indigenous to the digital sphere. They are native ministries that you can only do online. A clear case, for example, is how my own local church at the present holds online gatherings that include our members who are now residing in different parts of the world. Being a church in a small town and it's moved online with participants from across the world, our Sunday worship time, our Bible studies, our prayer meetings, our discipleship trainings, among others, has transcended already the borders of our geographic location, especially when a number of our members start to contract the virus and need to be quarantined at home. They are still able to continue joining the gatherings, and it serves as their lifeline to overcome the toll of being in deep isolation. Nowadays, we are now exploring using other platforms that provide a different way of having candid and interactive conversations online, like the audio-only social networking app, Clubhouse. And what I've been mentioning are just some of the features of building digital communities online that are not supposed to be replicated, much less compared to what can be done now face-to-face when the lockdown is over and the restrictions on physical public gathering shall be lifted. We shall surely open our worship halls and again meet now face-to-face. But the experience of being together with people who are not able to be in the same building shall be one that will be lacking and surely will be missed. So you think, are we going to just stop and drop the amazing experience we had as a digital church? Most probably not. I can see how it is likely for us to keep doing the best part of that way of being church and keep it as a feature of our faith community that will be, I think, hybridizing, if there's such a word, more and more. And this leads me to my third point, that hybridity is I think, is a key to a more holistic church. It may be a tendency in a lot of discussions we've been seeing online that the digital church issues is so focused on how to have Sunday worship, is that real worship or not, and other issues of liturgy, whether you can hold communion or not. But I think it is important to stress that it will surely miss the point of Hebrews chapter 10, verse 24 and 25, as Pete has mentioned. I think the point of making sure that God's people get to meet together, whether by in physical gathering or on-site or online, it is for encouraging and steering up one another towards loving our neighbors in the doing of good. Digital congregations are meant to engage in missions, both online and offline. So while not a few has feared that a lock-up church shall also mean restrictions on missions and ministry work, there is actually data that tells otherwise. For example, the Asia Evangelical Alliance, AEA, released a compelling piece of research. It features a national survey conducted in Indonesia at the height of the pandemic. And the findings show that 64% of churches were able to quickly adjust and adapt to the digital shift. When their pastors were asked whether they thought their church members had grown spiritually during that very difficult time, almost half said yes. And fewer than 20% said that the spirituality of their church members was declining. So the question is, what does this spiritual growth lead them to do? Here's the interesting part of the research. 94.78% of churches organize relief projects for the needy. Of this, 22.1% targeted their own members, but the rest demonstrated care for the needy outside the church walls. Can you move the slide, please? And almost, yes, please move the slide. There you go. So you could see 94, almost 95% was able to do projects for the needy. And almost half of the churches surveyed extended their hands to build bridges of collaboration with non-Christian religious entities in organizing interfaith relief projects. And 56.3%, that's more than half of churches, acknowledge the importance of other social institutions in helping the community during this tough time of lockdowns and everything by financially supporting institutions such as hospitals and clinics and schools and other community networks. So the research concluded with this. Can you please move the slide? One more. This is their conclusion. Before the pandemic, most churches carried out more than 85% of their church activities inside the wall. During the pandemic, when no gathering is allowed at the church building, the church has been doing church outside the wall, in homes, by Zoom, in the midst of the community, collaborating with one another, perhaps using social networks, especially to help the needy. And I'm convinced, by looking just at this data, that a quick embrace of digital technology has been a key in allowing churches to keep themselves connected and continue collaborating for God's mission, despite all the restrictions of the pandemic. Whether, here's the big question, can you move the slide? Whether the church should look at this experience as an exile that needs to end soon, or as a happy exodus that finally it happened, or as an Easter moment that saw the dead coming back to life. I think that's a question that I myself am very curious for answers. So thank you so much. Sorry, Pete, I go 2 minutes beyond my time.
No, Ray, that was, I mean, I could spend another hour listening to you. That was absolutely fantastic. Brilliant. I don't know, I mean, Pakwa, all of us need to kind of open up our microphones. Yeah. So, Pakwa, what do you think? Is it Exile, Exodus, or Easter moment?
Well, it depends on who you're talking to, right? I mean, there are some churches that I've heard that they are preparing to shut down online once the pandemic is over, whenever it's over. So, but there are also people who are now saying that, well, let's commit to go into hybrid church permanently. The conversation in my own church, for example, is that let's starts with terminal. Well, basically, we're committed to do it. We are not too sure what it means. So we have set up a task force to look at that. So it depends on who you speak to, actually. One church has gone entirely decentralized and so, yep.
It does. But the thing is, we mustn't be kind of too focused on hybrid being the answer now for, in perpetuity. Just as we kind of thought, building church buildings were going to be the place to do mission and everything. And God said, hey, there's bigger now because you're in a different society. So too, we've got to kind of always be on our toes to see where God's calling us next, don't we?
Yep.
Yeah, in a sense, Ray, this is just making me think so much. I think about Exile. I'm compelled to say that it's Exile, not because of the way that I think some people see it, right? As it's going to end and it was a bad thing, but I really do think your presentation is making me think now that perhaps it really has been a space, hopefully, of a kind of self-reflection on the part of the church, or kind of, being in quote unquote exile has allowed us to kind of see more clearly ways in which we were failing our mission. I think, for example, about the ways in which the pandemic has really brought to light issues of accessibility and disability and mobility within the church, and recognizing individuals who have always been in isolation, have always been in quarantine on some level. So in that sense, I'm kind of leaning more towards the Exile as this kind of, I don't want to say lament, but it really is a kind of almost purification in a way of the church. And perhaps the Exodus hasn't come yet, but I think, I'm really just playing with these categories. It's just so lovely. I have to think about it a little bit more, but that's great.
I know that Stephen Tumbargo asked in the Q&A, how should creolization in an endemic setting be best achieved in Christian churches? Anyone want to go for that one?
I'm not sure I understand the question. I mean,
how do we ensure that kind of, it's rather than just kind of, I mean, Stephen, you may need to kind of explain that a bit more in the Q&A box if you could. But how do we make hybrid not just kind of global one size fits all, but actually fit hybrid into the various situations where the church is indigenous? Will the church be the same? So,
I'm just thinking aloud conceptually. In my church, we are beginning to talk about, okay, yes, church is online now, but it is still a transfer of the physical to online. Can we build something that's more intentional? But once we say that, then we basically want to also say, if we have a digital worship service, what physicality do we want to build around that to support the community? Because we recognize that 21st century life is both digital and physical. And so we can't think only one channel, just digital, right? But it depends on the kind of context that we have. We have started an outreach to the community, the single mothers, people of different faiths that we work with. So if we want to build a church that reaches out to some of these people, how does that look like? So these are still questions that we work with. So it is very contextual at this stage. Yeah.
I think it's very also important to be mindful that the experience of digital is different for different countries across the world. It really depends on the kind of infrastructure. I mean, what the government has allowed to set up. I mean, and that would include internet speed, all of those things. I mean, and there would be types of digital engagement that would more or less be more appropriate in some context, depending on what is possible. So I think it's really, I mean, what is beautiful about this hybrid church is that not so many of the theologians and the top people of the church know what is happening. It is actually the lay people, the young people who understands the technology and who could say, why not we try this? Why not we do this? And I think that space for creativity and participation from the lay would really shape how expressions of hybridity would take shape in each particular context.
Yeah, I've written elsewhere about not the model of hybridity, but the category of enculturation. As a Catholic theologian, I sort of draw on John Paul II for this, and there are pros and cons to that. But one thing that struck me as I was looking at some of what he says about enculturation is, there's an analogy here to be made for the way that the church has approached missions throughout the centuries. And when the church imposes a particular cultural paradigm onto another culture, then it's participating in colonialism and imperialism. Whereas, there is a way to engage with a culture that requires a kind of deep humility and listening, and a lot of listening, a lot of from the online context, what I've argued is a sort of, spending significant practices of lurking to sort of get a lay of what Ray called the landscape, right? Instead of just bringing this sort of all of the conceptual frameworks that the church already has for what it means to be social, what it means to be church. Let's spend a lot of time just being Christians in a digital space. And I think that actually will be the lay the groundwork for whatever the church wants to look like, instead of just imposing the kind of, you know, on-site framework onto the digital.
It's been very interesting. I think the big model of hybrid church will be global phenomenon. So I was on the course, we actually have a video from Vugala Harvey, Timothy James, Pastor Mascona from Pretoria, you know, where he talks about the data poverty in South Africa and the way in which it costs so much to watch church online. Yeah, so you've got the whole kind of thing. So we may be in data rich countries, you know, we can get bags of data on 5G and everything, but that's very, very rare in our world. And so we've got to be very careful that those of us who live in data rich environments don't impose this kind of model of church, which needs all the resources of the world. Yeah, we need to kind of scale back on that and kind of say, well, let's allow hybrid to develop indigenous ways, you know, in proper ways across the world. Terry Puono from Tonga or Samoa talked at our global network meeting recently about the way in which the community needs to be brought in through keeping the VAR, and this sense of, you know, the first online Samoan, I think it was, funeral to happen, which kind of made such an impact upon that community, because it was that kind of hybridization of the VAR and the sense of what the community is about. So we need the color to decolonize the church and decolonize even the hybrid concepts of church, to allow people to develop church in their own way, in their own place. That was a statement rather than a question, I'm sorry. Hi, Cecilia, you're right.
Pete, yes, I noticed that Stephen has further elaborated on his question. I don't know if already it's been addressed. He says that to come up with a new and good hybrid culture, what key things should we consider?
Thanks. Anybody want to come back on that? What are the key things that we need to do to kind of create those kind of indigenous, decolonized hybrid churches?
I don't know if it's sort of a key. I would say that I've been saying for a long time that we need to be aware that being social has been changed by the digital, what it means to be social as human beings. And so in terms of, you know, having a, I don't know, like a new or good, I don't know the word he used, culture, from the church's perspective, I think it's to really try to find, not create, but to find already spaces online where people are having meaningful social human interaction. I think it's very easy to see the ways in which there is that distance, there is the vitriol, there is the, you know, ideological siloing, all of this stuff. But there also are meaningful spaces and meaningful ways of interacting, and to really figure out what that looks like. You know, what platforms are best for that, what features within the platforms are best for that. So for example, when I was looking at online masses, Catholic masses, you know, I looked at like different types of comment sections. Are those creating meaningful interactions? But then also kind of questioning, how am I judging that? You know, how am I judging what's a meaningful social interaction? So that's what comes to my mind first, is just to kind of zero in, and maybe this is sort of where the lurking comes in, to zero in on what people themselves now, you know, within a theological context or outside of it, what do people consider to be spaces where they can actually have a meaningful social interaction? And I say meaningful social interaction because that's a theological thing. You are meeting God when you encounter another human being. So where are people encountering one another?
Right.
Maybe what I will add is that whether online or on site, I think the principle to us is not what the church is offering and doing, but how are people participating? How are people engaging? And I think that makes a huge difference between live streaming worship services on Facebook or and having smaller gatherings via Zoom or other video conferencing where everybody can speak, everybody can be seen, and people can actually participate. So I think that a very good thing to always keep in mind is so how will people engage with this? Will they have the capacity? Will they have the accessibility to do it? Can they even afford it, as Pete has mentioned? So all of those kinds of questions, because at the end of the day, what you would like to see are people, the people of God moving, not watching, moving. Whether we are in a cathedral or whether we are in a Zoom room.
I think it's well, it's about adapting the technology to fit our purposes. So, you know, we church buildings at the moment are generally in the basilica format that they switched to in about 400 BC, 400 AD, when, you know, Constantine and others said, you know, all churches, all people should now be in the Roman Empire should be part of this thing. And so we created the kind of basilica model because that was the biggest building in a Roman town. Okay. And we're still there, you know, but we changed the basilica. We stopped it being a marketplace. We stopped it being a law court. We put the altar where the judges' seats were and things like that. You know, we adapted. We turned it into cruciform church. We changed it. We created preaching houses and so on. And perhaps we need to do that to digital technology as well. You know, as Heidi said, we need to shape the technology, shift it around a bit more, and just say, well, how do we really make this a good place to have encounters with God? Yes, encounters with one another, but also really good spiritual engagement as well. Anybody kind of want to come back on that? How do we make digital a good place to encounter the divine?
Well, I think among the few of us, I thought the least about the digital theology. What I work with is more of what's happening in church. I think spiritually, what I found, even a passive YouTube video, YouTube streaming, God does break through, and I've once had an encounter that touched my heart and moved me to tears, and it just took me by surprise. But this is often exceptional, but because I think like what Ray said, that the interactivity, the participation is actually important, and anything that fosters that should be a good guideline. But there's also one thing that I've always been thinking is that we need to meet people where they are rather than set a bar. So contextualization, even within the church, may have different tracks, so to speak, right? The older who struggle with technology, you need maybe more physical space. The younger one who wonders, why do you need to even meet physical, you engage them differently. That of course makes things a bit more complicated, but if you want to meet people where they are and then bring them to whatever place that you need them to be, and that spiritual principle is important. The next, I think, is again something that's Ignatian, is between what's the good and the better. I think often people quarrels or debate about this is bad, digital is bad, whatsoever. But sometimes you don't have options. Sometimes you have limited options. So the better question to ask is, what is the better among the alternatives that we have, right? So that basically, I think, at least in terms of setting the road forward for my church, that's the kind of principles I'll look at. Yeah.
I think what I will add is that the church should recognize that way before it was prepared to go online and make godly spaces online, people were already deeply formed by their digital engagements. Deeply, deeply far. And it is a shame that during the intensity of the lockdown, people find comfort and solace in Netflix. I mean, in some K-drama that gave them hope, that allowed them to at least forget the very difficult moment that they are in. And what I'm trying to say is that I do not believe for a moment that it is us who gonna take God there in the digital space. God must have surely been there way before the church decided to be there. And people already have find hope, joy, love in those spaces. And maybe it's up to us. If you really want to do a contextual effort to this, to listen, to see how is God moving already in these spaces, and then how we can join and participate. I think that's what Mission Day is all about.
Katherine, do you want the last word on this? And then we're going to hand over back over to Pakwa.
Well, one thing that came to mind, and maybe this was too long ago, but when you were talking about the basilica model, which I think is right, but I love a basilica, but I would say that, yeah, I mean, I love that idea of thinking about space theologically, thinking about the spaces that human beings come together, especially when it comes to worship. We I think have too long instrumentalized those spaces, even the grand ones, even the ones that are packed with mediation and media, paintings and everything. I think that figuring out how to come together online will once again, maybe this goes back to what I was trying to say about Exile, will once again get us thinking about what we are doing on site. If we have to be very careful in a I think a positive way, careful about crafting spaces online that are going to be better for certain kinds of interactions. I'm hoping that will then make us think, well, maybe there are ways, and there are ways in which we are failing on site, and how can we think more about, the physical space, but also the sort of like cultural space that we've created at a local level or maybe a regional level. So I appreciate, that kind of thinking about the sort of the spatial realities of on-site and online. So yeah, that's something that comes to mind.
Okay. Thank you to all the different panelists, and what I really appreciate, and we should do this more often, right? Bringing everybody from different parts of the world and really share perspectives that we don't think of when we are in our own small little lockdown country, especially for Singapore, and to hear the richness and the struggles and the context, and to remind ourselves there's no such thing as one hybrid church. But really, there's all sorts of it, all sorts of different contexts that we have to struggle with. Now, you have heard a lot about Pete's course, at least he was alluding to it quite a few times. So once again, if you're interested to find out more about what's a hybrid church, to just get things going, just go to the course at either the QR codes or at the Theology for Life platform, and you can find out more about that. Now, in terms of, I just want to round out in terms of our upcoming events. Wesley Hill, who has spoken at BGST, is coming again, so to speak, on Zoom, and is going to just share with us in terms of his perspective on spiritual friendships. And again, because of hybridity, or because of what digital can offer us, now we can bring different panelists from Asia to come in and to just speak with and engage with Wesley on this topic. So feel free to sign up for this course, for this webinar, which will be held in 2 weeks' time. So with this, let me just stop share. Well, with this, once again, thank you so much to our panelists, to our attendees who have joined us, particularly for Catrion, who have to wake up so early to join us in this part of our world, whichever part of our world you are in. And it's great to meet all of you. So with that, I bring today's session to an end. And of course, if you have friends who want to find out more about session, this will be posted The video will be posted shortly at the Theology for Life website, YouTube channel, and we will put up the details to you by email. So with this, may I invite Pete to just close us in prayer.
Yeah, dear Lord, just thank you for the riches of your mission, of the way in which you reach out to us continuously to engage us with you. You kind of invite us along and say, come on, come and join my journey. Come and join this exciting new thing that I'm doing. And we pray, Lord, that this course might be helpful to people as they kind of start out on new journeys around Hybrid Church. And yeah, as Pakwa said, thank you so much for the wisdom that Ray and Katherine and Pakwa and others have shared with us today. We pray that that too might be a place where we've encountered God in their teaching. Bless us, Lord, and we just pray that you would help us to do more and more in terms of your mission on this earth. In Jesus' name, amen.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.